Hello, and welcome to Phenomenon Radio, the show that covers thought-provoking breakthroughs in the fields of UAP UFOs to discover fascinating truths, first-hand accounts, and investigative insights into the expanding confluence of physical and mental exposure to this worldwide phenomenon. Hosted by world-renowned experiencer of the 1980 Rendlesham Bentwaters UFO incident, John Burroughs, and Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist Linda Moulton Howe. And now, leading off the program, here's Linda Moulton Howe.
I have known New York Times best-selling author Jim MARRS since the late 1980s when he told me about a 35-millimeter color slide that a sheriff showed him at an animal mutilation conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In that slide was a blue beam of light coming from above onto a mutilated cow. During my TV production of A Strange Harvest about the worldwide animal mutilation phenomenon linked to unidentified aerial phenomena, A Strange Harvest, several ranchers told me they had witnessed beams of light coming from aerial objects down into their pastures where they found mutilated animals. Jim MARRS was born and raised in Fort Worth, Texas. Jim has been tracking down facts and trying to make sense of political stories in America since his college days as a journalism major at the University of North Texas in Denton. He graduated in 1966 and began a newspaper reporting and editing career, first at the Denton Record Chronicle and then the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, and later at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. He was an investigative reporter and cartoonist and earned photography awards. By 1988, Jim MARRS decided that he had to put his big file about President John F. Kennedy's assassination into a book. The result was an instant classic called Crossfire. 2 months after its release in 1989, Jim received a call from Hollywood film director Oliver Stone, who wanted to option Crossfire for the Hollywood movie that became JFK. After that, Jim MARRS began asking book editors what they thought was the next big, dark, secret government cover-up beyond the JFK assassination. Unanimously, he says the answer was UFOs. As Jim began to nose around for more UFO information, he stumbled on to the government's efforts to produce psychic spies who could remote view anywhere in the world, in the skies, underwater, and even on Mars and Jupiter in the solar system, and return with facts beyond routine field intelligence by normal agents trudging through streets, alleys, agencies, and corporations. I remember the depressed telephone call that I received from Jim after he thought his Spies manuscript had been accepted for publication and then was canceled for mysterious reasons. As a celebrated and successful author, Jim suspected a deliberate government block to keep his reporting about the remote viewing Enigma Files about UFOs away from the public and media. Here is an excerpt from a discussion Jim and I had in 2007 after his book, Spies, was finally published.
I think the reason they had to suppress my book was because after laying a very credible foundation for the science and history of remote viewing, I then went into the Enigma Files, which basically is that every single one of these military government-trained remote viewers at one time or another had direct personal knowledge of UFOs.
Yes.
That's what they could not allow to get out in a credible manner.
Ingo Swann told me about his own personal experience in the Pentagon of doing a remote viewing target, only latitude and longitude, and when he began to draw, it was a submarine that had a disc over or to the side of the submarine. Mm-hmm. And when he was asked by the military authority sitting across from him at a desk, "You can't mean a UFO," and that Ingo responded, "Yes, I do." At that moment, they gathered up the paper, the pencils. Everybody left the room, leaving Ingo sitting there by himself.
That's right. That's right. That is a good illustration, actually, of several things. He was not tasked to go see a UFO. He was tasked to go see a submarine. And yet when he went and viewed the submarine and there was a UFO nearby, obviously his attention was drawn to the UFO. And this is why each and every one of these spies had personal knowledge of the UFOs. I have been told that they were never at any time tasked to go look at UFOs. Now, Linda, that only makes sense because how could the government, which for 60 years has tried to tell us that there is no such thing, order their official remote viewers to go look at something that they say doesn't exist? But when they went out looking for other things, for example, if they were tasked to go and look in the upper atmosphere for high performance and high flying aircraft to see what the Russians or the Chinese or somebody might be testing, they would go up there, they'd see these things splitting through the atmosphere, and they go take a mental look at them. And as one remote viewer told me, they weren't us and they weren't the Russians. He said those guys weren't even from the neighborhood. One of the best and earliest remote viewers was a former police detective named Pat Price. One day he showed up with a report he had written about these 4 alien bases that he had seen on the Earth.
After this short commercial break, Jim MARRS will join us to talk about those Enigma files, including remote viewer details about 4 alien bases on Earth and different types of non-humans using them.
You're listening to Phenomenon Radio, live on KGRA-DB with Bentwaters experiencer John Burroughs and Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist and Earth Files reporter and editor Linda Moulton Howe. Tonight's special guest, Jim MARRS, will join us right after these messages. Stay with us.
Find the podcast on Spotify, iHeart, Audible, and Apple Podcast. Get the best on the X.
Thanks for joining us tonight on Phenomenon Radio for tonight's interview with very special guest, Jim MARRS. To start tonight's interview, here's Linda Moulton Howe.
Jim, thank you so much for being with us on Phenomenon Radio today. I read your Sci-Spies book in 2007, and I was struck by the importance of one of your sentences in the Enigma Files chapter, where you wrote, quote, "When the Sci-Spies and they remote viewed and tracked these UFO objects back to their point of origin, the remote viewers found the UFOs came from subsurface locations on our moon and Mars, and that they would land in subsurface locations on Earth," close quote. Could you now take us into your Enigma Files and describe the 4 alien bases remote viewed on Earth, the types of beings in them, and what Pat Price found when he tried to remote view the source of the alien beings?
Right. Again, with the military-trained remote viewers, in fact, I think there was a hesitancy on the part of officialdom to even acknowledge UFOs or ETs or anything like that. And yet it was just there. And when they go to look at something, it would be there. And Pat Price came in one time and said, "Oh, by the way, I found these 4 alien bases on the world," and everybody kind of rolled their eyes and went, "Yeah, well, okay," and they kind of filed it away and didn't pay much attention to it. And then some years later, when they were in full swing and they were training more and more of these Sci-Spies, as I call them, they were intelligence officers that were being trained to use their psychic ability. It's what we used to call clairvoyance, where they could sit in a chair, go into kind of a meditative type state, and then throw their mind out and visualize other places and things at a distance. And this has been proven in the laboratory to be correct. And what's really fascinating is that the training helped them focus and helped them attain pretty good results with this thing. But what they found in the laboratory was that every single one of us, we all have this innate ability, some more than others, obviously, but it's all there. So while they were training some of these other remote viewers in later years, they decided, well, let's really stretch the bounds of credulity, and let's see if we can't give them something very, very strange to look at. And they remembered Pat Price's project, so they went to the files and they dug it up, and they tasked several of these remote viewers. I don't know exactly how they were primed, but the basic thing was they were sent to go look and see if there were these alien bases. And what's really fascinating and lends support to this whole thing is that they all came back and said yes, and they saw various aspects of the same 4 bases. So that really substantiated what Pat Price had said. Now, these bases, according to Pat Price's material, one is located under Mount Perdido in the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. And it is kind of an air base as they come and go there. And then there is one under Mount Inyagani in the African nation of Zimbabwe, and that one is apparently a maintenance and repair base. And then there's another one under Mount Hayes in Alaska, which is apparently a weather and geological study center where they study the topography and the weather patterns of the Earth. And then there is the 4th base is under Mount Zeal in Australia. And what's interesting there is they describe that as a R&R, rest and recreation base, where several of these craft, apparently from different species, would come and gather. And I don't know, I remember when they were describing this rest and relaxation base in Australia, I kind of got this mental picture of the barroom scene from Star Wars.
Right. And Jim, wasn't it Mel Riley, who was such a talented remote viewer, who was working on some projects for the U.S. Army, and that he actually was involved where they were looking at a satellite photograph or remote viewing, and all of a sudden, Mel Riley, in his remote viewing session of that, he came up with a craft that had humanoid people in it. Do you remember that? And can you talk about these different types that remote viewers have encountered?
Well, yes, and that's true. In fact, they all had various experiences along that line, and basically what it was is pretty much what the UFO community has been trying to tell people for a long time, is that there are multiple races out there having contact with the Earth, but of course it's not open contact. They're just coming around. But some of the things they've seen, the one that really kind of got me, as I recall, was they saw these small, multifaceted, mirrored type objects that were very smooth and kind of crystalline in nature, and they referred to them as a buckyball, okay, after Buckminster Fuller, because if you remember his geodesic domes, they're multifaceted, and they saw these things in orbit around the Earth. And what was really fascinating about this is that when there was a normal space shot that was going to, just put a normal communication satellite in orbit or whatever, these little balls are up there floating around along with all the other space junk, and nothing would happen. But the times when we'd try to put something up there, either an unannounced space shot or a space shot that they said, well, we're not going to tell you much about this one because it has military applications. In other words, when they tried to put something of a military nature in space, they saw these buckyballs dropping out of orbit and striking the craft and blowing it up, essentially, just kind of destroying it. And, of course, that just really struck me. I thought, oh, wow, could this even be? But then there is some interesting feedback on that. For example, I have a copy of Space News from August 23rd, 1993, And the headline says Titan IV motor is prime suspect, but the story says the explosion of a Titan IV rocket, August the 2nd, appears to be linked to a solid rocket motor segment that was repaired several years ago by the manufacturer, said U.S. Air Force Colonel Frank Sterling, the Titan IV program manager. But in a strange twist, Sterling said he had been told that the Air Force video of the launch shows an unidentified object apparently striking the Titan at an altitude of about 110,000 feet shortly before the rocket blew up.
Wow.
Hello?
Yeah. And Jim, when you go to Mel Riley's remote viewing session where he saw this craft that had humanoid people in it, it was hovering over a nuclear storage facility. And he said or told, and whatever his debriefing session was, that these quote-unquote visitors were bean counting, taking an inventory of the number of armed warheads at that military depot on this planet. And that goes right to one of the major questions about RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge back 35 years ago in December of 1980, when nobody in the general world or media understood that at both the RAF Bentwaters side and the Woodbridge side, there were nuclear tactical armaments there. And that
leads to the story, and even books now that have been published from former military officers about how that, they were changing. In fact, Colonel Corso, in his book, After Roswell, mentions how that they were somehow manipulating with the launch codes. And, there's kind of a divergence of thought on that. I know Colonel Corso, when I interviewed him, I said, why do you think they're hostile? And he said, because they were coming over our very sensitive military bases, and we'd order them to stop, and they wouldn't stop. Well, I kind of got a laugh on that one. But then he also said, and we think that they were messing with the launch codes. But then, on the other hand, you have to look and say, well, maybe they were preventing us from blowing ourselves up.
Exactly. And that is where I was headed with the question to throw to John Burroughs, because the issue of agenda in all of this that is so complex, ranging from Peniston saying they were time travelers to exactly what you just went to the heart of. And I was asking the question, depending upon which side of the Pentagon you are sitting, you would interpret that messing with codes or interacting with any kind of launches or satellite positioning would be a hostile act, but to the general human population, it might actually be a non-hostile act. This issue of agendas, alien agendas that you went into with such detail in one of your books.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, though, there is so much evidence to show that kind of activity was going on. I know in the summer of 1995, as I was putting the finishing touches on my UFO book, Alien Agenda, the Mars Observer went into orbit around Mars and then suddenly was lost, okay? And so the big question at that time, of course, was, well, what happened to the Mars Observer? Well, I contacted some of these remote viewers I'd been dealing with, Mel Riley being one of them, and they said, well, the same, we've looked at that, and what happened to the Mars Observer was the same thing that happened to Phobos 2, which was a Russian Mars probe. And I said, well, what was that? And they sent me their material, and I still have their original drawing. They show when the Phobos 2 went into orbit around Mars, they saw this odd-looking circular-shaped object rise off the surface of Mars, go out to meet it, scan it with some sort of electromagnetic energy, and they said the impression they got was this was not a hostile act. In fact, the analogy I got was this was like the tugboat coming out to meet the Queen Mary, and said when they scanned it, then they realized that it was nothing of theirs, and this object turned around and went back to Mars. But when they scanned it, this scrambled the onboard computer, and we lost control over it, over both the Phobos 2 with the Russians and with us with the Mars Observer. And the Mars Observer then spiraled in, burned up, and crashed into Mars. Now, what's fascinating is that we actually got feedback on this because in the late 80s, following the Phobos 2, Soviet cosmonaut Lieutenant Colonel Marina Popovich came to the United States, and I have a photograph of her holding up one of the last photographs taken by Phobos 2 before it was lost entering the orbit around Mars, and it shows this kind of odd-shaped semicircular object, but with one side kind of caved in, kind of an oblong shape, and it's amazingly similar to the object that the remote viewers drew. So there is support for all this. This isn't just wild-eyed speculation.
And Jim, did Mel Riley ever remote view the intent or we'll say the non-human intelligence that was behind that scanning device?
Well, yes, in a way. It's all very, very esoteric and very weird. I know that the remote viewers they were all, like I said, they were never officially ordered to look at UFOs, but of course unofficially in their off times they would all share information and talk with each other, and they all became very curious, and they said, and it soon became quite obvious that since they had all had these same experiences, that this was very real, it was all going on, and they kept trying to remote view to answer the very question you were asking, and then they finally said, well, why are we looking at these individual incidences? Let's see if we can trace back and go back to the headquarters, go back to the launching place, where'd they come from? What are they up to? And so Mel Riley, for example, I had the incredible experience of sitting down with Mel, and he showed me some work he did, remote viewing what he called, for want of a better expression, Galactic Federation headquarters. And he said he saw this place with these very high, rugged mountain peaks, and then there was kind of a big body of water there with kind of a flat plateau overlooking it. I got, when he was describing this to me, I got the analogy of Lake Titicaca, okay?
In Peru.
In Peru. And he said on this plateau was a huge pyramid. And so he psychically went up this ramp into this pyramid. And let's see here, I've got his words right here. He said, I find myself moving up an inclined causeway with rough stone walls on both sides. At the end of the causeway is a long, dimly lit rectangular corridor constructed of smooth dressed stone on all sides. He said, this is an entrance to a beautiful white pyramid-type structure on a rocky-type promontory. And inside, he said, there was a huge chamber, and in the center of it was, for want of a better expression, a rectangular object that was kind of like a pedestal or a altar, okay? And he said there was a group of robed figures standing around that, and that in his mind, he went up and laid down on this thing, and he said, I think I asked him, I said, would you feel strange? Did you feel like you were intruding on something? He said, no, quite the opposite. He said, it felt like a familiar place. And he said, and I never felt like that I was in any danger or that this was any kind of negative thing. And there was something, there was like beams or some kind of light that was streaming down onto this altar. So he said he was getting some very familiar and warm feelings out of all of this when he basically came back and woke up.
But who are they? Who are these robed figures?
He didn't know.
Well,
he didn't know.
And doesn't that come down to where we all are on so many questions? And
that's right.
John is dealing with being haunted he can remember blue lights in Rendlesham. But John, in terms of the whole question of what happened at RAF Bentwaters and remote viewing about it, do you have, in the work you've been trying to do, do you have any insights from anybody that you have read about in terms of RAF Bentwaters from the remote viewing point of view?
Well, yeah, it appears that at least one document's been declassified by the CIA, and a remote view, and I guess it was considered a practice remote view, was done by Lynn Buchanan. And then I've learned today that there's a good possibility everybody in a remote viewing program at one time or another did the same type of remote view on the Rendlesham area. But Jim, I'm curious about something. Okay, initially the government got up and walked out of the room, right? That's what you said, right? They didn't want to hear it.
Right.
Did they ever change their tune?
That happened more than once.
Right, but did they ever change their tune? Did they ever learn anything from this? And then you said there's an alien agenda. Did they learn anything to help them counter or deal with the alien agenda?
Basically, no. And the reason for that was there was too much disunity among all that. Okay, for example, they were constantly, this remote viewing program under the military and the Army was under constant surveillance or oversight. There was oversight committees. They were constantly coming in and trying to test them, and there was such a divergence of opinion because some people thought that they were really onto something, really, and bought into this whole remote viewing experience, and others just said, this is bogus. This is nonsense. Why are we wasting our money on this? In fact, I'll never forget, they told me about an experience they had with one general officer that they went in and gave him some intelligence that turned out to be correct. And he was really fired up, and he said, well, where'd you get this? And they said, well, it's just tell. He said, no, I want to know where this came from. So they broke down and said, okay, this came from the remote viewers. And he said, here, take all this and get out of my office. He says, I wouldn't believe this even if it is true. You can imagine that kind of mindset. But, yeah, that's what they had back in the 70s and 80s. That was the mindset. Now, what's really interesting is the way they kept getting funded is that they would have these people come in for oversight, and they'd give them, flip charts and slideshows and everything else trying to explain what they were doing, how they were doing it. And most of the time they were met with disbelief. So what they finally got to doing was they'd bring in, say, some ranking officer, and they would put him through a session and let him do it. And they explained to me one time in some detail about how this one general came in, and they let him go through a session, and he saw, in his mind's eye, he saw this place, and there was some water, and there were these houses and buildings, and he gave a very good description of it, but it didn't seem to relate to anything they could place. So he said, well, I think this is all bogus. And so he left. Well, that afternoon, as he flew out of I guess it was Washington, wherever he flew out of, he looked out the window, and he saw the very thing he'd been looking at. Okay, what he probably did was just remote view a little bit ahead in his schedule anyway. He came back and he said, okay, never mind. I think you all are onto something, and he continued their funding. So they got a lot of positive mileage out of letting some of these people do it themselves. But even then, there was always somebody else that didn't believe it, so there was just a constant fight for funding. And, in fact, I think that was the whole deal. They finally, that's why in the fall of 95, the CIA, who had bowed out, this was an Army program. The CIA had been on some of the initial experimentations, but they really weren't even involved. But all of a sudden, they started a study, coincidentally, about the time that my book was about to come out and break this story to the public, and then they canceled it. But at that same time, the CIA ordered up a study of remote viewing by a scientist named Ray Hyman, who was unalterably opposed to it, who went into it saying it's a bunch of baloney, and I don't believe in any of this. But they kind of messed up because they put him working with a statistician named Jessica Utz. And so Utz and Hyman issued this report, and the report said, well, statistically, there's something going on. But we don't know what it is. We can't explain how it works. So I guess we're not getting much out of this. And that's the report they issued, and the CIA publicized that in a release. And if you stop and think about it, that's pretty unheard of. Since when does the CIA ever voluntarily release one of their secret studies or secret programs?
And Jim did that on purpose to deflect public and media from accepting the credibility of remote viewing.
Exactly, and that has continued on up through that fairly recent movie called The Men Who Stare at Goats. Right. That was about some of the early experiences with trying out this psychic phenomena, and they were trying all kinds of things, and some of it was pretty silly, and some of it, but some of it worked. The key thing is that they didn't want the public, who, you know, we all have this ability, and they didn't want the public remote viewing because, guys, in my opinion, I think it was remote viewing on our part and remote viewing on the part of the Soviet Union that caused the collapse of the Cold War, because the Cold War was built entirely on secrecy. The Russians weren't sure what we had, and they weren't sure what our agendas were. We weren't sure what they had. We weren't sure what their goals were. And so, but then with the advent of this psychic phenomena and remote viewing, and I call them the Psi-Spies, the Soviets called them extra sensors, and we were both looking at each other, and we realized that the Russians didn't have near what we thought they had, nor did they have this burning desire to conquer the world. And they saw us, and they saw that we did have everything we said we had, but that we too were not, trying to conquer the world. And the secrecy fell away, and the Cold War ended.
And there's another facet here that has come up in the R.A.F. Bentwaters Woodbridge mystery and has come up, I think, in remote viewing, and that is how much of what we are dealing with in the unidentified aerial phenomena, technology, whatever it is, that could be time travelers from someplace in the future coming back here. And haven't you talked with some remote viewers about the remote viewing access into the future?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In fact, the very first time I tried remote viewing myself was pretty interesting, because I was getting ready to fly out to New Mexico, to Albuquerque, and I was going to meet with some of the remote viewers out there, and they said, come out to our headquarters. That's all I knew. And so I thought, well, I'm going to try this out, see if it works. And I did have a little leg up on this whole thing in that years before, as a reporter, I had gone through a session on transcendental meditation and had been taught some of the techniques of how to put yourself into a meditative state. So I sat in the chair and I got real relaxed and kind of got in a meditative state and said to myself, okay, what does this remote viewing headquarters look like? Well, I got the very distinct impression of a one-story strip shopping center type thing, a strip mall, with kind of earth tones, and then on the corners, on the four corners, there was something raised, okay? Well, now where I got off was that I'm thinking, well, I'm going to Albuquerque, so that must be that southwest motif, with the logs that stick out of the top of the adobe-type buildings. But then I said, I wonder what the floor plan is. And I got a very clear picture of this floor plan, and I sketched it up, and I even wrote entrance, reception area, where a large conference room, offices, and a hall that made a 90-degree. Okay, and I took my drawings of the place and the floor plan out to New Mexico, and they took one look at it and said, now I'm thinking I'm not any good, because it turns out their headquarters was a person's home, a ranch-style home. It wasn't anything like what I had seen and drawn. So I said I left all my sketches there, and I thought to myself, well, I guess I'm not very good. But about a year later, I went back, and this time when I showed up, they handed me my sketches and my floor plan back with a little note on it that said, good job, because in the meantime, they had decided they wanted to go into teaching remote viewing, so they had gotten some offices in a strip shopping center with, as it was in earth tones, with corners that were raised, except where I thought there were logs sticking out. They were little lions' heads, okay? And then they showed me the official floor plan, and it was 100% accurate to what I had drawn. So in other words, and this building was not even built at the first time I went out there. So in other words, I had remote viewed into the future, into when their actual headquarters came into being. Now, that's pretty wild.
Well, how do you think that's possible if, I mean, that suggests that the future really is locked in, as Einstein always said long ago. And today people are saying, well, that can't be. We must have free will. If you could remote a year into the future, is time completely locked in and we're just carrying out the embroidery and the stitching?
That's a really good question, and no, I don't believe that's the case. I look at it this way. I think time is like a river, a large river, like the Mississippi River, and it's flowing, okay, in one direction, okay? Now, the thing is, so in that grandiose sense, then the future is predetermined, okay? If I knew you, Linda, even better than you know yourself, if I knew all about you, and say I knew that you absolutely craved ice cream, you loved ice cream, okay, then I could accurately predict that if I offered you a bowl of ice cream, you're going to take it. Okay, but that's not because it's etched in stone. It's simply because that is the flow of everything. I know you like it. I know you're going to take it. Okay, and yet you do have free will. You can turn down that ice cream if you have enough willpower. So, in other words, my idea, the way I see it is, we are all on little rafts on this river of time. Now we can lay back and just kick back and let it float with the flow, or we can turn around and paddle like mad and try to paddle against the current, which a lot of people do, and they have a hard lifetime, and they don't understand why everything's so tough. It's because they're paddling against the current. Or we also can paddle over to one side or paddle over to another side. So if you see what I'm getting at, there is free will, but within the confines of a general time flow.
Jim, I'd like to go back to a couple of things that you brought up a few minutes ago. Number one, they remote viewed different quote-unquote alien bases. Did our government ever, or any other government, act on that? And then second of all, you mentioned how both sides were remote viewing each other. I've read some about the program, but did either side, or especially us, did we ever try to remote view to see if, in fact, say the Russians or the Chinese had any kind of interaction with some kind of alien intelligence, and did they glean anything from it, and also maybe some technology from it?
Okay. Boy, there's a slew of questions here. First off, to the best of my knowledge, our government never made any official attempt to remote view UFOs or the base or anything else. Now, that's to my knowledge. You have to understand that it wasn't that I particularly was going to break open the story of remote viewing. Joe McMonagle was already out of the unit, was already working on a book. There had already been a few other little stories mentioned in it, and Ed Dames was out, and others, Dave Morehouse, and they were all working on making this public. So I think they realized that they couldn't keep the story of remote viewing bottled up forever. So the only reason they stopped my book is that they wanted to control the release of the information so that it wouldn't go to a widespread general audience in a credible way. And that's pretty much what they've done. Anyone today who wants to know about remote viewing can pretty well find it out, and there's several books on the topic. Some of them really good, some of them not so good. But again, I don't think because of the diversity of attitudes within the military and other places in government. As far as I know, they never made a real effort to track all this down. I'll also say, though, that today, if you ask anybody in government, do you have a unit of remote viewers, they're going to tell you no. And I think technically they're telling you the truth, because what they've done today is that they have taken various groups, let's say the Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, some of these special military groups, and they all have a remote viewer embedded within that organization. And it only makes sense, particularly if you are a special forces type unit. Any commander of a combat unit would love to have somebody along who might be able to tell them what's on the other side of the hill. So that would be, but I don't think that the government, to the best of my knowledge, has never made a coordinated, systematic effort to try to use remote viewing to find out what's really going on. I think one reason they don't want to is because they don't want to find out what's going on. It might upset their status quo apple cart.
Wouldn't it make sense, though, that if you're trying to spy on the other side and some of your remote viewers actually have seen something like this, that you would ask them to see at the other side what they were aware of and what they were dealing with?
Well, they knew about the other side, and they saw each other all the time. In fact, they crossed paths, in the ether, I guess as you call it. In fact, John, it's kind of funny if you remember the old the cartoon about the sheepdog and the wolf. And they'd say, "Good morning, Fred. Good morning, Joe," and they'd punch in, ching, and then the rest of the cartoon, they're trying to steal the sheep, and the wolf's after him. It was kind of that kind of thing. Early on, they said they would go out and be tasked to go look at something, say in Russia, and they would go there, and then they would realize that they themselves were being looked at. And then, so they became aware that they had opposite numbers, people in the eastern side that were also remote viewing. And at first, it was kind of funny. They said at first they thought, "Oh my God, it's the enemy," and they'd want to go into a fighting stance, or they'd want to, "Where's my gun?" And then they had to stop and realize that they were in an ethereal form. They weren't in physical form, so they couldn't really do anything to them, and they couldn't do anything to us. And so they just got to where they would kind of see each other, and I don't know if they actually waved and said hi, but it was like, there they are. Yep, there they are. And they just went on. And again, see, it tore down the secrecy, which was behind the animosity of the Cold War. So, yeah, they were very much aware of what the other side was doing, and they were aware of what we were doing. And in fact, as Linda probably could tell you, the Russians have been actually way ahead of us in publicly discussing UFOs and aliens and putting out information that their government had acquired.
Right. That goes back to that Valet book with that Soviet scientist, having to do with remote viewing, psychic telekinesis, that the Soviets have been trying to work on that since the 50s, 60s.
Right. Now, as to the various races that you were asking about, there apparently is a pretty good myriad bunch, but primarily they talked about the smaller grays, the taller grays, the very human-looking like blonde Aryan types, the reptilians, and then this thing that has been described by so many people as kind of like a praying mantis, a truly alien-looking type thing. But what's funny is the most alien of these races, I guess, would be the praying mantis-looking type thing. And yet, according to the people who have encountered these beings, they say they seem to be some of the most benign and the most intelligent.
And ancient.
And
the praying mantis was described by several people in the human abduction syndrome in the early 80s as, quote, as old as our solar system, because their job is to monitor the creation of solar systems and to seed life. It's incomprehensible to us. Right.
Well, that's the whole thing. I mean, we talk about aliens, but if something's truly alien, it would probably be very difficult for us to describe, much less identify with.
but it could relate to when Peniston got the binary code and downloaded telepathically the concept that we were dealing with time travelers from a future that had some sort of a survival problem, and that they're here harvesting eggs, sperm from humans, animals, earth life, and all of that. Mm-hmm. Have you, at this point in 2015, come to any more bottom line perspective from all of your work about whether that is a viable, at least one answer to the unidentified area phenomena for not only decades but centuries?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think... well, you know, you go back to, actually, I can prove that I was actively looking at the UFO question by the mid-1950s, okay? And I want to tell you that back in the 50s and early 60s, the burning question among the few people that were paying attention to that issue was, do they come from Mars or do they come from Venus, okay? But as time went on and as we got more information in and as there were more and more people with experiences, we learned more. By the 70s and 80s, the question became, well, do they come from Zeta Reticuli 4 or do they come from Alpha Centauri? In other words, do they come from another galaxy instead of another planet? And then by today, now, we've got some very serious works that we find where people are speculating that do they come from a future time and they're using time travel? Do they come from a different dimension? You know, scientists are now telling us that we operate in 4 dimensions, but there's actually, they already figure out there's probably at least 9 or 10, and probably more than that. So did they come from one of these other dimensions? Okay, now, the answer is yes. All of the above. I think they're all coming here, and I think they represent a variety of races and a variety of agendas. But the good news is that the only thing that I feel very confident in saying is that I don't believe that any of them are here to invade the earth, blow up our cities, destroy everybody, eat everybody, for the simple reason that if that was the plan, the historical record shows they've been here since prehistory. So, you know, why wait till now when we have space flight and laser beams and all this new technology? Why didn't they just conquer us when all we had was spears and clubs?
Mel Riley's remote viewing suggests that there is an alien presence on the Earth that has been here past, present, and probably future, and that it is underground, underwater, but it is inside or using this planet on an ongoing basis. Yeah,
apparently so. And apparently that we are quite an interest to these other races. And of course, since the fact that we don't see thousands of these folks around, and they're not, you know, it's very unusual for most people to see a UFO. There seems to be more and more in recent years, but basically it's still kind of an odd occurrence. So that apparently there's not too many of them, and I tend to think that the ones that are here as observers, anthropologists, if you will, who want to come and visit, see what's going on here. Although I think there are maybe some hidden agendas, like I think, water seems to be prevalent in a lot of the UFO reports. I know Ingo told about he and some military people, through his remote viewing, they had determined that a UFO kept appearing at this lake up in the northwest, and it seemed to be siphoning up water, and it would do this on kind of a regular basis. So they actually went there, and they set up on this lake and hid and waited to see, and sure enough, this thing materialized out of thin air and then began to draw up water. And as they crept closer and tried to get photographs of it, apparently it realized it was under observation and it winked away. But so maybe they're after water, maybe they're, and of course we get to your ballywick, which is the animal mutilations. I think, to me, what I have, because I began covering animal mutilations here in Texas back in the 70s, before that even became a major issue. It was down here in North Texas where there's a lot of cattle ranches, and cattlemen were getting pretty upset about their cows being left mutilated. What I finally came to a suspicion on that was that once I found out from some scientists at Texas A&M that the cow has 23 chromosomes, very, very similar to the human chromosomes. And then, of course, the old line about you are what you eat. And let's face it, most of us eat beef. And I think that the reason for taking these cows and for cutting out their softest tissues is to study the impact of pollution on the earth. And, of course, if you wanted to find out how that was affecting humans, you'd want to take humans and cut out their soft tissue and study that. But, of course, I don't have to tell you that if we were finding a lot of dead humans with their sex organs and their mouths cut out, that there would be a huge hue and cry, and that would cause a lot of problem. So they take the cows instead. And this also accounts for the fact that early on, animal mutilations is a big story. You know that. You right. Began to break those stories years ago, and others have followed suit. And then, it's like, yeah, okay, it's happening, yeah, okay. But neither you nor me nor the government nor anybody else can come to a satisfactory conclusion on exactly who's doing that and how and why. And as a result, they're still going on to this very day, but they just don't get reported on.
And Jim, if the animal mutilations might be, let's say, repulsive or have the tincture of something dangerous or repulsive, you could say that might be a reasonable reason for a government to have policies of denial. But we're going to a break. And after we come back, what I would love to explore with you is why do you think that the Ministry of Defense in England is still withholding 18 classified documents related to at least policies about unidentified aerial phenomena? And it is John Burroughs. It is his work that leveraged open that admission. So after this break, let's talk about why such strict policies of denial.
That wraps up the first hour of tonight's interview with special guest Jim MARRS. To find the latest on Jim, log on to his website at www.jimmarrs.com. That's Mars with 2 R's. Stay tuned right here on KGRA as we start hour 2 of tonight's program right after these messages on your choice for UFO Paranormal Talk Radio on the World Wide Web.
Taking paranormal talk radio to a whole new level. TheUnXNetwork.com.
As we continue tonight's interview with Jim MARRS on Phenomenon Radio with John Burroughs and Linda Moulton Howe. To begin the second half of the show, here's John Burroughs.
Thanks, Race. We're back with Jim MARRS. Jim, I'm sure you were aware, the big buildup the MOD had where they supposedly released all their files and, they gave them all to the archives and they were finished. Well, one of the things that I got involved with in my research was I came across Project Condign, and in Condign there was different things involved in it, but through Condign I was able to do some FOIA, and what I learned from the MOD through the FOIA was that they hadn't been truthful with the public. They actually were still holding at least, and they say at least because it comes down to this: they told us they'd released everything prior. Yet then I found out they've admitted to at least holding 18 more files. 6 of them are policy files. And the interesting thing within Condign itself, it was quietly released to the public, a lot of that's still redacted. So that means that even though they claim they've released stuff, they really haven't, because if you still keep stuff within what you release classified, then they really haven't been honest with the public, number one. And number two, they're holding at least 18 files to include 6 on UFO policies. What say you about that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I've been looking through this Annex F, and it's it's really interesting because they freely admit that the high frequencies that can direct hazard effects can be high. So, it makes you wonder if they're admitting the stuff that they release, that these ionizing radiation, non-ionizing radiation can be harmful. What in the world are they not telling us?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Jim, why do you think that they released this? It was a DI-55, DI-52, 460-page report, UK eyes only, handed over to the MOD in December 2000. 6 years later, for reasons unknown, completely under the radar, it is unclassified from UK eyes only. And John and I and others didn't learn about it until around 2010-11. And why do you think, from everything you've been exposed to in doing occulted history ruled by secrecy, alien agenda, Crossfire, and knowing the governments play really hardball when it involves money and technology, why do you think that this 460-page report, basically a confirmation that non-human, unidentified technologies are here on this planet, and that the UK studied it and put out this huge report that says, with titles and sections, mental impact of UAP radiation, can damage tissue, can manipulate minds, can make minds see images that are not there in 3D reality? That's in this report.
Exactly.
Why would they release it?
Well, I see two things. The least likely is that, enough time went by, they got new clerks in there who didn't realize the significance of what they were releasing, and that it was just released basically as a mistake. But I don't really buy that. I think more correctly what's going on is that you can't keep any secret buried forever. Okay, all you can do is, in the words of Napoleon, it is unnecessary to bury the truth. It's only necessary to just put it off long enough until nobody cares, and that kind of is what's going on here. It's out there. The people in the UFO community already know a lot of this stuff, or at least assume this. And at their conventions and stuff, they all talk about it. And as far as the public goes, they don't know. And unless they present a shocking public revelation on mainstream TV, the BBC or NBC or CNN, and repeat it over and over again, the public just doesn't get it. So they're not in any danger. They know it's going to be out there anyway. And I think personally that it's all part of a gradual a conditioning process that we've been undergoing since Majestic 12 and the clamp down on UFO information back in the late 40s and particularly in the early 50s. And some of that has taken on a life of its own. I think part of the reason today that you're not going to have a military officer or a leading government official get up and say, okay, here's what's really going on, is simply because out of embarrassment, nobody wants to get up and say, okay, folks, we've lied to you for 70 years. Okay, so it's just not politically expedient. So it's a limited hangout. They put out this information for the people who do want to get it and be confirmed in their suspicion and in the things they've learned. But yet, it's not something that's going to awake the public overnight.
Well, why do you think that Prime Minister Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, said to Georgina Bruni, who was writing a book about R.A.F. Bentwaters, of course it's true, but you can't tell the people? And she used that phrase from Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher as the title for her book. What is it that the UK and the US governments could have been afraid of at such a level, or what would have been the reason that this could not have been just the public, here, this happened in England, and this is what happened, and all these men like John Burroughs were affected?
Well, let me give you one that happened over here. for my book, Alien Agenda, I interviewed a fellow named Bill Holden, who was the loadmaster for Air Force One. And in the summer of 1963, he was on Air Force One with President John F. Kennedy when they made their tour over to Europe, in which Kennedy made his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech. And apparently there were some stories in the European media at that time about something about some UFOs. And Holden told me that Kennedy was very approachable and that he was there on Air Force One with him and said, Mr. President, what do you think about this UFO situation? And according to him, President Kennedy said, and mark these words, I would like to tell the public about the alien situation, but my hands are tied. The alien situation. Hello? Okay? Now, he and Margaret Thatcher, you have to understand, no world leader like that. They don't, regardless of the fairy tales and the things we'd like to believe, people at that level do not operate on their own. They are surrounded by handlers and advisors and consultants and whole committees of people that tell them you can't do this and you can't do this, don't do that. Okay? And I strongly suspect that both Kennedy and Margaret Thatcher at some point were given secret briefings by military people who said, you cannot tell the people about this. We've done studies. The Brookings Institution has done studies. If the public is suddenly aware that they're not alone in the universe and that there are aliens on this planet, it could cause widespread panic. It could cause the collapse of churches and religions, and probably, everything would just go to hell in a handbasket. And so out of the most benevolent of reasons and rationales, because they didn't want to disrupt society, they went along with the cover-up.
Could ISIS be any less scary than aliens and ET technology?
Well, yeah, possibly, because, if you're worried about ISIS, all you have to do is stay on the lookout for somebody with a turban and a beard and an AK-47 and run away. But if you have to worry about aliens that could appear in your bedroom in the middle of the night, it's a little bit more scary.
Well, I agree with that, but here's something that I've come across. In Condign, it says clearly there's a race by all the major players or powers of the world to weaponize this.
Right.
So we're trying to outdo each other. So it's here. There's something going on. Condign clearly lays that out. It doesn't fit the criteria of a lot of people want to accept it, or it doesn't go into great detail because it's a secret document, which it leads into, it could cause grave problems for the MOD. That's clearly why it was classified. There's probably a higher classified document, top secret or above, that goes into even more detail. But there's a race to weaponize it, and the weaponization part would come. Whoever owned that weaponization, would be able to control the world, and control their own population. Plus, also within Condign, within this radiation and frequencies, there's a possibility they're looking at it four-dimensional travel, interstellar travel, warp drive, or whatever, and that's all coming out in the mainstream public now. So I agree they're starting to let some of this out, on top of what President Obama said a few months ago, where he said they tell us not to talk about it, and I think he was being truthful. But then there's also the part of I agree that it could affect how people view, their security-wise, but at the same time, we may be reaching a stage now where they're going to lose control of this. I mean, whatever it is going to start making itself more prevalent, and that's going to be their loss of power totally, so they've got to start conditioning for us that.
Well, John, I think you just hit the nail on the head. It is potential weaponry, okay? Now, you were in the military, and you know that if there's something the military considers could be a weapon that could give them an edge on the battlefield, they're going to classify it, right?
Right.
I mean, boom. Because if we let everybody know about it, then our enemies are going to know about it. So I think you really hit the nail on the head there, is that anything that they view as potential weaponry or military technology, and a warp drive, even though that might not be weaponized, and yet that could certainly revolutionize warfare, so that would come under that same heading. That's why they have to keep it secret. And I think that explains a lot. Plus, you also have to understand that the people who are actually trying to rule this planet, I refer to them as the globalists. Actually, they refer to themselves as globalists because they run multinational corporations, that look upon the whole planet as their, customers and as their potential profit centers. And they owe all of their extreme wealth. And I'm not, I think you know who I'm talking about. I'm not talking about presidents or vice presidents or CEOs. I'm talking about the people who own some of the basic resources of this planet. And you get into the heart of the banking system. And these
80 families, Jim. 80 families.
Yeah. 20 banks, pretty well controlled. 43,000 international corporations. Anyway, it's very centralized, and they owe all of this power and wealth to these monopolies that they hold over energy, petroleum, pharmaceuticals, telecommunications, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I don't think they really care that much if we all know that there's aliens out there and we talk about aliens and flying saucers, et cetera. But what they care about is if the general public should suddenly overnight realize that this is all very true and they are there, then they will also realize concurrently that there is alternative technologies out there that are being kept from us, okay, so that this wealthy 1% can hold on to their monopolies, and it could disrupt those monopolies. I'm working with a fellow right now who's, for the last several years, has run his entire house on hydrogen, which he makes himself in his backyard, okay, by electrolysis, separating the oxygen and hydrogen from plain old ditch water. And oxygen, he lets the pure oxygen in the air, which helps clean the air and give more breathable air, and he uses the hydrogen to run his car and his truck and his lawnmower and his house and his air conditioning and everything else. He is energy self-sufficient. And during Hurricane Sandy, when everybody around him lost power for days on end, everybody in his immediate area was coming to his house to plug in their cell phones and their batteries to get them recharged so they could struggle along. And he's sitting there just totally energy independent. But, of course, we don't want to hear about that. In fact, I keep warning him, to watch his backside because they don't want their monopolies impinged upon. And I think that's a great reason why they're keeping the lid on the whole story of ETs and UFOs.
And the back engineering that they have done on that technology.
Yes. Because not only at the very basics are you messing with these globalist monopolies over technology, but then think of the corporations that would like to get hold of it and have a monopoly on some sort of energy production or energy manipulation.
And according to Lieutenant Colonel Corso, there are corporations going all the way back to World War II and on where he was personally hand delivering from the Pentagon extraterrestrial technology to corporations like ARCO and what was GE and back then to specifically back engineer extraterrestrial technology to get it patented in the United States and kept out of the hands of our perceived enemies.
Exactly, and the thing is, if you actually, you have, but if people would actually do their homework, they'd find that not only did Colonel Corso give very intimate details of how he introduced alien technology into our modern conveniences and modern corporate life, but then you go to others, Dr. Edgar Mitchell has publicly stated that we've gotten technology from alien craft, and so has a myriad number of other people. So, all you have to do is just listen to these people who know what they're talking about, and you would know that that's exactly what's going on. But then you also understand, Linda, that with the military, specifically at the higher ranks, at the levels of the colonels and the generals, particularly the ones who are involved with these things, they all have their contacts with the military industrial complex, and most of them retire at the ripe old age of 45 or something, and then go to work as a vice president for General Dynamics or LinkedIn or Chancebald or one of these, defense contractors, and that's where a lot of the what they've learned in the military is passed along to the private sector.
Well, most of it's now to avoid FOIA. I mean, our former Secretary of State just got busted for that. But most of this stuff is no longer in the government channels. It's passed on to defense contractors, and they're the ones that control it, and then the government can deny it. I mean, I'm holding the FOIA right now, and I'm holding on to it because when the MOD first admitted they had 18 files, they didn't announce it. I waited a little while. Then I did a press release. Then they did a brief announcement they were going to release some more files, and they went quiet again, and it ended up on the House of Lords. Well, this guy pushed twice, and now they're saying sometime next year maybe. But I think they're in a bind because they're going to have to admit why was their policies and why is this stuff still classified. But I also got a FOIA where they admitted that they've been able to glean some technology from this phenomena. They've developed a weapon, but guess why it's classified? It's classified defense, but it's also classified that it belongs to a government contract, so it's patented. So therefore, they don't have to release that to me.
Right.
Well, that's pretty shifty, isn't it?
Well,
Yes,
that's exactly what Corso said, Jim. I remember talking to him and saying it was General Trudeau talking with his World War II colleague, General Eisenhower, who became president. And Trudeau and Eisenhower calculated that if they could get the extraterrestrial technology patented in American corporations, it would get it off the backs of the Pentagon and the military into corporations. Of course, only one person per corporation would know, and that then the corporation would grow and evolve on extraterrestrial technology that no one knew that was what it was. But as long as it was patented, then it was out of any responsibility for the government to say that they knew about extraterrestrials or technology.
Exactly. Back as early as 1947, the head of the Air Force Material Air Command wrote a paper, and he said that, number one, that flying saucers were real. They weren't illusionary or visionary. And later in his document, he said, if we actually put our mind to it, we could build a similar craft. So they knew in 1947 they could produce something like that.
And do you think, Jim, that Pienemonde in Germany and Hitler in the Nazi movement was truly backed up by one of the extraterrestrial biological entity groups on this planet in a power move?
I'll tell you what I put together, and this is just based on everything I know. And as you know, my knowledge of the Third Reich is not inextensive. I think what happened was, for one thing, we've all heard stories about how the Nazis captured a flying saucer. They got one in North Africa. No, they got one in Eastern Poland. No, they got one here and there. And yet, every time I tracked those, it never quite went anywhere. There's no evidence that they ever had physical craft in their possession. I think what happened was that going back to the time of World War I and going into the 1920s, there was not only in Germany but also here in the United States this spiritualism movement, okay? People were having seances, and people were channeling, and they were doing all this weird stuff, which, of course, for the longest time, everybody thought, well, that's nonsense, but then that's the same thing they thought about remote viewing and clairvoyance, and that turns out that that's been verified in the laboratory, and we know there's something there, and it's very real. And I think that in the 20s, through some of these esoteric occult societies there in Germany, that they were telepathically or psychically able to communicate with non-humans. And I think they got hold of some group, probably, my guess is the Aryan-looking ones, the tall blondes with the blue eyes, and that's why they put such emphasis on that. They thought that was the apex of civilization and evolution. And these people initially saw that the Germans and the Nazis, they all wore sharp uniforms, and they all marched in lockstep, and they got a crumbling economy back going so that by 1936 they were the economic powerhouse of the world. And they said, oh, wow, these guys, they really got it down. Let's support them. And I think that there was an exchange of information that led to some of those fantastic and phenomenal scientific advances.
Meaning ET intelligences, the alien presence, was then willing to inspire behind the scenes the creation of this technology for Hitler to use.
Yeah, exactly. And they of course, then the Nazis used it the same way we would have, and the same reason the Russians did and the Chinese did, which is to build weapons. And the next thing you know, they're building V-1s, V-2 rockets, the Me-262 jet fighter. If they had had those just 6 months earlier, the whole tide of the war could have changed. But and I think at some point these non-human intelligences is, oh my God, what have we done here? Look at these people. They're murdering people, and they're just systematically murdering people. And they've gotten out of hand, and so I think they withdrew their support, and I think that that's why, thank God, the Allies were able to put 26 nations together and overcome the Third Reich.
And that's why the Vril craft were not seen in the skies of the planet everywhere, because something changed between the non-humans backing that technology and that it was being built underground at Peenemünde. But something happened to, as you say, withdraw that technology, and it became almost historic during World War II.
Right. And they cut it off at such a point to where they were able to, at the end of the war, to build. I'm pretty convinced they had some operating flying saucers. In fact, I'm even willing to bet that may have been what was used to run off the Admiral Byrd's fleet in Operation High Jump down in Antarctica. But they only had a handful, and they didn't have the infrastructure to build more, and they got cut off from the technology. They couldn't advance it anymore.
Well, Jim, I'm curious about something. Okay, the Bible was written through channeling, through God, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
These people probably won't even physically hear them, possibly. They were channeling to them and getting this information, which means they may not have actually been physically here, but they were able to channel through them no different than the way the Bible was written, and at some point they cut it off. Is that possibility?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. And then, of course, you've also got the same thing, which I'm convinced also happened with the Bible, which was, yes, it was very much inspired by outside force, but yet it's filtered through the human brain, and so as a result, some things might have been misinterpreted or misunderstood.
All right, well, we're coming up on our break. When we come back, I'd like to expand on that a little bit more.
All right, stay right there, everyone. And for the latest in science, the environment, and real X-Files, visit the award-winning website at earthfiles.com with over 2,000 in-depth reports that go far beyond the 6 o'clock news. earthfiles.com. We'll be right back with our final segment of tonight's program with special guest Jim MARRS.
Find us on Facebook and Twitter, and be sure to check out the show pages to get all the deets on your favorite shows on xnetwork.com.
Welcome back to Phenomenon Radio with tonight's special guest, Jim MARRS. To kick off the final segment, here's John Burroughs.
Thanks, Race. Jim, before we went to the break, we were talking a little bit about how you could see or perceive what we're dealing with. And what I wanted you to expand on is people think that they're physically here all the time, when in reality it could be they're not. It ties like to the Bible itself, where they channeled and people see God and the Word of God, and you channel into whatever this is, whatever you want to call it, ET or whatever, and certain people can see it because they have the ability in their mind's eye to see it. So it'd be a little bit different than that we've got flying saucers all over the place flying around, correct?
Yeah, but also you got to understand we're not always in our bodies. Nobody is. When you go to sleep, you dream. You go somewhere else. At least your mind does, your essence, okay? So you know, we're actually kind of should be used to going out of our body on occasion, and it's really fascinating.
It goes into frequencies in your mind's eye, right? Because one of the things that they worked on based off of this technology was God's helmet, right? That the guy in Canada developed. So there's a lot more to this than just people say, well, I haven't seen one flying around. How come we don't see them all the time? When in reality, it's something completely different.
Right. There's been biological studies showing that they've done studies where they've had people. They did one study that they showed they got people that were ill, and then they had two groups. One group would pray for them, and the other group would, not. And the people that got prayed over got better most of the time. You know, there was more there, which shows the power of the mind. Because we are, after all, beings of energy. We all know this, or should know this. Science tells us that our whole body is energized. Okay, there is a electromagnetic field surrounding each individual. Some of the New Ager people call it the aura, but it's still there is an electromagnetic field there, and it's also been shown that when you die, this field does not dissipate. It doesn't just disappear and go away. It lifts up. It moves off somewhere, okay? So the essence of all of us, and people need to understand this, because if they understand that when they die, they're simply going to go do something different, and they're not going to be, lost as a thinking entity forever, then that could really reshape the whole world right there, because so many people do some of the bad things they do because out of fear, and mostly out of fear of death. And yet, if they would understand that at the basics they are a energy being that is inhabiting what I call the meat sack, and when the meat sack gives out, because any natural thing, it falls under natural laws of entropy and finally gives out and wears out, and so when the meat sack dies, the inner spark, the soul, if you want to call it that, it continues on. And the religions even tell us that, okay? But most people don't like that. In fact, if you think of the cop shows and the gangster movies and war movies and everything else, if they're trying to extract information out of somebody, the worst thing to do is threaten to kill them. Oh, don't kill me, I'll tell you anything. Well, wait a minute. What if you understood that you're not going to die? You're just going to go do something else. It could change the whole dynamic.
That
right.
Reincarnation is real, and it was one of those statements from a man who had had a face-to-face with one of the Eben entities back in the 50s, and I was able to communicate with him a bit before he died. And one of my questions to him as a military person who had spent time with one of the Ebens was, is reincarnation real? And one of the answers that he sent back that I still have was, reincarnation, the recycling of souls, is the machinery of this universe. So that was coming from an ET to a human, from this military guy. And if you also combine that there is the body, mind, and soul, and you look at how much information has come just in the last 20 years about non-human technologies being able to cloak that invisibility is part of the alien presence, that they can be in the skies, in the water, and we humans with our eyes with a very narrow range of being able to see only invisible light, we do not see what is in the skies.
That's right. That's exactly right. And we all know that not only light, we can see, there are myriad frequencies of different colors that we cannot see, okay? Just like there are frequencies of sound that we cannot hear. You blow the dog whistle, the human can't hear anything, but the dog can hear it. All right. Or the thing I usually tell people when I'm in a group of people is just say, hey, there's a bluegrass band playing right now. And they look around and go, what are you talking about? I say, well, if you had a radio receiver, all you got to do is turn it to the right frequency and you'll hear the music. And they go, oh, yeah, that's right. So see, we have music and sound and sights and views and colors all around us every day, all the time, that we can't see or hear. So what's the problem of thinking that there are other creatures who can?
Right. And one of the things that I'm curious about, you've done a lot of research in this, do you believe, A, that we're coming to some kind of showdown where, the different things, remote viewing, and maybe they even looked at this at some time in the future, like going between now and, say, 2022, that there's going to be some
How about now and the end of the month?
Okay, well, then I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit.
Well, there's an old line that says, if everybody tells you don't look well, maybe you ought to lie down. Okay? And I'm telling you, every day, I tell my wife I'm an information magnet, because I have people literally around the world who send me stories, and I read voraciously, and every day I get all these emails, and I'm reading anything and everything, and conservative columns and liberal columns and everything. It's all this coming in and rolling around. And I want to tell you something, everybody from preachers to prophets to stock market analysts to financial advisors, and they're all saying, it's really kind of spooky, because they are all saying now is the time to buy ammo and tomato seeds. They all tell you that you don't look well, maybe you ought to lay down.
Well, Jim, are you tying that into this fourth blood moon that is rare and is in September? We're going to be doing a phenomenon next week with John Hogue, who has written about the blood moons and what is coming this from here out going forward.
Linda, that's just part of it. That's one of them. That's one level of people that are looking at that, saying this is a sign that things are going to get very tumultuous, And then you got the people who are talking about the incoming Nibiru, Planet X, Wormwood, whatever you want to call it. There's something going on there, because there's really no question. The old global warming has kind of taken a hit, because they showed that they fudged some of those studies, and that they were being a little bit alarmist about some of that, but there's really no question that there's climate change going on the Earth. But what people are not clear about is it's not just the Earth. The polar caps on Mars are diminishing; they're melting. The ice on some of Jupiter's moons melting. The outer planets are becoming more luminescent, which means they're heating up. And something, whatever this is, whether it's unusual sun activity or whether it's some body moving into the solar system, something is causing perturbations all throughout our solar system.
And Jim, it could also be that it has been projected now for about 25 years that this solar system would be moving in to a thicker dust on the arm of the Milky Way galaxy than we have ever been in as a species.
That's right, and we've already moved into it. We're moving into it right now.
Moving into it, exactly. And it takes 26,000 years for our solar system to go around the center of the Milky Way galaxy. And whatever this is in the arm, this galactic fluff that we're going to be moving toward is not just a 26,000 year. This may be something that the Earth hasn't experienced for a very long time. And there have been projections, and this is where it really does become physically, this is hard physics data. This is of great concern. It may not happen in the 21st century, but it may very well happen in the 22nd if we get there, that this dust and this fluff in this part of the arm that we're going to be moving into as a solar system could push the solar wind completely toward, let's say, Mars. And that would mean that the inner planets that have been protected, like we have been protected by magnetic fields from the solar wind, if it gets physically pushed, then these inner planets could be in real trouble, and that this could happen in thicker fluff. Now,
Well, you've got that. You've also, we could be the victim of an asteroid strike at any time. They had that big meteor that struck in Russia here some months back, and nobody saw that one coming. So you really don't know. And also, plus, there could be stuff coming at us. And stop and think about it. If you're president of the United States, or if you're president of the world, and there's something coming at us, and there's a good chance it could obliterate the world, are you really going to tell everybody about that? Okay, probably not. Probably you're going to just let them be happy right up to the last minute. And then, now you're talking a very grandiose scale here. The Pacific Rim has been heating up volcanically all around. You got volcanoes all around the Pacific Rim, and they're getting more frequent. You got the Yellowstone caldera that could obliterate the northern part of the United States. You've got this volcano off the Azores that could cause a 300-foot tidal wave to hit the entire East Coast. I mean, you got this grandiose stuff. This could all happen, okay? And then you come down and you realize that even the stock market analysts are saying we've reached the end of our tether. We can't print any more money. It's worth less and less and less. The current financial structure of the world is fraying, coming apart at the seams, and it's all going to give way here, and we're going to have to change and do something else. And then, and it just goes on and on and on. And so I think we're in for a time of real upset, upheaval, but it depends on where you are and how you handle it, okay? If some of these geophysical disasters occur and you're in the middle of it, then, God help you. But for a lot of us, I think it's possible we may just watch all this on TV. We watched the tsunami overrun Japan and overrun those Asian countries. We saw Fukushima spew radiation, and what a lot of people don't realize is it's still spewing radiation, and it looks like that the fourth plant's going to go. It's already irradiating the Pacific. People who are following that say the Pacific is becoming a dead ocean. Now, think what that could mean. The Gulf of Mexico is in bad shape because of the oil spill down there, and they're still spraying Corexit, which is pushing all that oil to the bottom of the Gulf, so it doesn't look as bad, and yet it's killing off the sea life. And, in fact, I know most people here in Texas do not want to even eat seafood that comes out of the Gulf. So, I mean, we got all of the Mediterranean's already predominantly dead. So, I mean, we just got all this stuff going on, but most people just watch TV and hope for the best.
Well, it's like a dripping apocalypse. What do you personally think, from all of the traffic crossroading in your desk, might happen in September this year and between September this year and 2022?
Well, I think definitely there's going to have to be a financial reset. We just can't keep going. That derivative market is again ballooned up, and there's nothing there backing it. The U.S. dollar has nothing backing it. We saw last week, as a matter of fact, the stock market dropped 1,000 points, when China devalued the yuan. And then if it wasn't for the plunge protective team jacking it up by about 600 points, it would have crashed. And so, of course, that would lead to other crashes, which leads to other things. It's just our whole civilization is, I think, in a very precarious situation. And if enough people don't start getting serious about making some serious changes, which, is almost, I think, is nearly impossible because people don't want to change. Never underestimate the power of the status quo, okay? And so I think that there's going to have to be some general collapse before we can put it back together right.
And you think that the stock market was electronically manipulated by some controlling force from that 1,000 drop?
Well, we already know that. Don't you remember a few years ago when they determined that they were sending those signals to certain elite inner people who could then jump and buy things and sell things, stocks? They were the stock market is manipulated. You're going to get a better deal by betting in Las Vegas, and in Las Vegas the house wins all the time. So it's I don't know. It's something that we're all going to have to face, and we're all going to have to start figuring out better ways of doing things.
Well, how much of this rocky barter system and the geopolitical territorial conflicts right now on Earth in human bodies do you think is being orchestrated behind the scenes in a matrix by three competing extraterrestrial civilizations, as has been described to some people in the past?
Well, I think that's a very real possibility, and then you lay that on top of a series of confrontations and interactions between several groups of humans. Okay, you've got the Anglo-American financial system. You've got the Vatican. You've got the Nazis that are unreconstructed and still have considerable power because of all the power that they took with them at the end of the war. You've read my book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich.
Right.
We defeated the German military in World War II, but we didn't defeat the Nazis. In fact, there were nobody representing the Nazi Party at the surrender in Reims. They just moved, went to Egypt, went to Argentina, Mexico, came to the United States under Operation Paperclip, and they've been buying their way back into power ever since.
Well, then do you yourself ascribe any particular group of non-human intelligences with that bloodline that goes through Hitler to the Merovingians, really, back to Mesopotamia? Right.
Well, you and I have talked about this, and I think that our best guess, and it is only a guess, would be the tall blondes.
That the tall blondes would be the root race behind the Anunnaki? Or reptilian? That's the confusion.
That is the confusion. Well, and the thing is, there seems to be, if you want to get into, we could almost have a whole show just, I guess, on the reptilians. But if you listen to all of the many people who claim to have had experiences with these reptilians, they have the ability to shapeshift and to make themselves appear as human as you and I or anyone else. Well, that kind of throws the whole thing into a cocked hat. Who knows?
Right.
And
right.
I think you and I talked about this at one point, is that this, again, could be one of the basic reasons for the UFO secrecy. Not only do we not know which alien species we're dealing with, much less what their agenda is, but even they themselves may wonder and may be in the dark about exactly who's who, what's what, and what everybody's after. So as a result, they all agree that we just don't want to bring this into the open. We'll just play out this sub rosa Cold War.
Well, and there is supposed to be technology in the infrared range that our government and the UK government for sure are using from helicopters, focusing on humans in order to differentiate whether they are roly-poly, Homo sapiens sapien, or non-human.
Exactly. And that brings up another concern of mine, which is, as things get tougher and tougher, and this 1%, these New World Order people, feel like they may be losing control, what's to stop them from using advanced technology to create things in the sky, who knows, pictures of Muhammad, pictures of Jesus coming back, scaring the whole world, or bringing the whole world to heel, because we do have this technology. I saw, go on Google hologram T-Rex in Dubai, D-U-B-A-I. There is a YouTube clip showing this Tyrannosaurus Rex, a rhinoceros, a cheetah, an astronaut in a spacesuit in this mall in Dubai, and they look real. And they're walking around in the mall. And so, if we have that technology and are actually using it right now, you can think what the ruling elite could pull out of their hat.
And is the ruling elite on this planet hybrids or full-bore ETs?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. But I would submit to you that what we tend to think of as just corporate indifference, or worse yet, corporate greed, and in their race for profits, might actually be an agenda by these people, or these beings, to reduce the human population, to mine the resources of this planet for their own ends, and to terraform, to change the entire environment of this planet to be more suitable for them, which leads to the question of, since there's no question that there seems to be a handful of people who are trying to run the world, I think the question can legitimately be asked, are they even us?
Right, exactly. And if they aren't, and if the barter system of this planet is being used for control by competing extraterrestrial civilizations for their agendas, then what happens for the rest of this century, even if we get to we're not alone in the universe, hanging on the other side is, who is here? What is the alien presence? And what do they all want?
Exactly, and these are the questions that we have to get answers to if we expect to progress and prosper as a species. Hey, would you agree with me, Linda and John, that there are probably species out there who would be agreeable to try to help us, okay? But we need to ask for their help, and we need to be prepared to accept their help. And
what did they want at RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge, December 1980.
Exactly. And was that a planned operation, or was that just they just happened to land at the wrong place?
My guess is it goes back to what we talked about over the last couple of hours, that we were working on frequencies, radars and stuff there, whatever we were doing, and that area is known for a hotbed for the phenomenon itself, showing itself, that we attracted something in that night. And I go along the lines, if you wanted me to kind of give you an idea what I think is going on, I don't really think that they're here, but they're affecting us by coming in and affecting our minds and getting us to do certain things. That would be my take if anything's going on that way. Not that they're physically here, but they're mentally controlling us. And that's what we're trying to work on, learn how to manipulate and do mind control on each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. We are working on that, that's for sure.
And I think we learned it from them. If that, if you want to take it to that level, that would be more along the lines of what I believe. They're not really here, but they affect us mentally, and that's what a lot of what's going on to this day.
But John, if you dealt with all the people in the human abduction syndrome who at noon have walked face to face with a non-human at their barn or walking along a creek, you would know that humans are having experiences with things that are organic biological entities.
Well, but then you can go back to the Bible itself and Christ. When the guy was writing the Bible, he claimed Christ appeared in front of him. Was that really Christ, or was that the image that was put into his mind that Christ was there?
And if it's a really superior hologram, we would never know the difference.
Well, listen, folks, there's also the real problem of individual perception. John, if you and I and Linda are walking through the woods and a little diminutive green figure runs across our path and runs back into the woods, you might say, hey, I just saw an alien. And Linda would say, no, I saw a demon. And I'll say, no, I saw a leprechaun, And we all experienced the same thing, and it was real, but our perceptions are all different.
There you go. And I'm sorry, Jim, but at this moment, we're out of time. Race, take us forward in time to next week.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. And remember, next week on Phenomenon Radio, John Hogue will join the program. For John Burroughs, Linda Moulton Howe, and Jim MARRS, thanks for listening to Phenomenon Radio tonight. We'll see you next week.